Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of September. Today we're doing a frontline update looking at the situation around Verbove, looking at the situation on Novodonetske, Klishchiivka, and Luhansk fronts. We're going to begin by looking at the changes to the Verbove sector, and I don't have really that much to go over in this region. There's just two things that have to be discussed in terms of changes. The first one is on the manned infantry trench, and so is the second one. And when I refer to this trench, I've been talking about it for a couple of weeks now. It's the one that I'm going over with these red lines. So on the southern part of this trench, it was generally thought that the Russians had solid control over it based on footage from the Ukrainian side of their various drone groups hitting Russian targets within these trenches. But it seems like now the Ukrainians have been able to send squads closer and closer to the southern parts of this manned trench. So it's in the direction of these blue arrows, which would mean that the fields in between the anti-tank ditch, which I'll mark in yellow over here, and the red lines that I've marked on the map is most likely a gray zone, and that the Russian forces are concentrated within the manned trenches and not really in the fields to the west of them. And this is due to the fact that now there's video evidence of Ukrainian troops actually beginning to attack towards these trenches from the south in the direction of these arrows, and you have firefights breaking out between the Ukrainian infiltrators and the Russian VDV forces that are manned within these trenches, and they're using artillery and ATGM fire to push back the Ukrainians. So far, the Ukrainians have been unable to hold on to their positions that they were able to temporarily take within the southern parts of the manned trench, but it does indicate that the fighting has shifted a bit to the east, you could say by, let's say, 1 kilometer at most. Now, if we go a bit to the north, this is also pretty interesting. There is a video over here showing a Russian attempted counterattack northwest of Verbove. I can't say for sure if it was successful, but I'll describe basically what occurred within the video and I'll show it to you guys in a second. But in essence, what you're seeing from the Ukrainians in this region is that they are sending these small squads that infiltrate past the anti-tank ditch, and they also infiltrate within the manned trench, and they do this on a regular basis. They don't really stay there for a permanent period of time yet, but they are rotating very regularly, so there's always Ukrainian activity in this region, especially at night. And what you're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces, they're using these predetermined paths that were paved by the, you could say, the vanguard of the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian infiltrators that originally crossed past the anti-tank ditch, and they found the best route past different hedgerows, past different tree lines. And you could see generally they're using this route over here. You could see where I have the arrows marked, and they cross the anti-tank ditch and they go through this hedgerow, or they go through this hedgerow over here, or they go through this one over here. And that's when they enter the trench itself, and they go what I would call trench hopping, because the trenches over here are separated by the hedgerows. With once the trench reaches a hedgerow, they get cut off, so they're not connected anymore. And then to go from one to the next, you have to basically get out and go to the next one. So what we saw is that the Ukrainians, they were able to get past the first portion of the trenches in the northwestern part of this trench system, and they were able to reach this, basically this hedgerow over here, which was their easternmost advance ever recorded. I talked about that yesterday. And that would indicate that the Ukrainians were able to at least push in that direction and become active there. It doesn't say that they're controlling it, but that the gray zone has shifted in that direction. But since then, there has been a new video posted showing a Russian BMP that was heading in the direction of that same exact Ukrainian position in that hedgerow. And presumably the Russians, they started out on this road over here, and you can see them advancing from the north all the way to the Ukrainian position within this hedgerow. And as they approach, you could see the suppressive fire, and then the Russians, they dismount their infantry. It's a small squad, and they dismount at generally this point. They take up positions not within the trenches, but within the hedgerows. And the video cuts out before you could get a good idea of how much they were able to advance, but it does give us an idea of the fact that Russia is operating in this region and that it's not been taken under Ukrainian control. The reason why this entire region is important and why I'm mentioning it is because the Ukrainians have a reason for why they're sending so many infantry squads towards this trench over the course of multiple weeks. The reason why is because their goal in this region is to amass such a presence and to do it in a way that would be comfortable for them to launch attacks even deeper into Verbove. And it would be probably from the northwest, because that's where the Ukrainians are sending most of their infantry squads in that direction. but it could also be from a bit further to the south, because you're also seeing Ukrainian attacks in that direction, as I previously mentioned. So here's that video. I'll quickly go over the main parts. Here you could see the hedgerow, and you could see how the specific BMP is advancing adjacent to it. And this is the direction that it's going in. You can see the fire that it's conducting in the direction of the Ukrainian positions. And you could see how eventually it's going to dismount. I'll move forward towards that point. And you could see how the Russian infantry, they get out, and that the BMP then withdraws. For a certain period of time, it was actually firing in the same direction as the Russian soldiers, so there was a threat of friendly fire, but eventually it stopped. And then you could see here the Russian soldiers getting out. They're in some dug-in positions on the entire hedgerow line, and then the Ukrainian positions are a bit further up north. And this just gives you an idea. This is just a microcosm of the sort of fighting that we're seeing on a daily basis in the sector, and that's why I'm going over it so specifically, so you get an idea of just like the daily events that are going on for the average soldier fighting in this region. But then, as you can see at the end, the video will cut out. The video is important because it gives us an idea of what Russia is trying to do. They're not just sitting idly by as the Ukrainians attempt to advance. They're not withdrawing at the first sight of Ukrainian attacks. What this shows us is that the Russians are conducting an active defense with sometimes localized counterattacks, such as this one, involving sometimes vehicles as well. We also saw that in Verbove yesterday. In my previous video, I talked about it. And it gives us an idea of the fact that the Russians want to protract the Ukrainian advances for as long as possible to further attrit them and ensure that the counteroffensive goes on for as long as possible going into the autumn and winter months as well. Around the Shaitanka River front, as I'm now calling it, because the Shaitanka River is a dividing line between the Ukrainian and Russian forces. It also separates the Ukrainian lines from Novodonetske and Novomayorske. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians, there has been a little bit of an increase in the intensity of the fighting just to the west of Novodonetske, but I would say there has been a decrease in the fighting just to the north, and just to the north of these two villages over here, Novodonetske and Novomayorske, as the initial Ukrainian assaults were not able to produce a breakthrough past the Shaitanka River due to a lot of mines and artillery and prepared Russian defenses in the region. But if we look a bit to the west, you could see that there have been recent Ukrainian attacks in this direction. Not anything that over the top, but you have seen some Ukrainian squads and some Ukrainian vehicles as well. There is a high utilization of vehicles in this region, just to the east of Voruzhenia, compared to a place like Verbove, for instance. And the problem with that is that Russia has mined a lot of these areas in the gray zone between the Ukrainian and Russian lines, respectively. There's not as many lines deeper into the Russian positions. But on ground zero, there's a very high concentration of Russian mines, which makes it difficult for vehicles to break through in these regions, even though it looks like a very good place for vehicles to be roaming around to reach Russian positions. But here you can see there's one video showing an unsuccessful Ukrainian assault east of Voruzhenia, and I won't show that video, but you can watch it by clicking on my map. And then here you have a video showing elements of Russia's 37th Motorized Rifle Brigade, and they were holding out in one of Russia's forward positions in a local trench that was dug up. And there's also an underground component to the trench. So the Russian forces in that region, they were holding off Ukrainian assaults for what appears to be like 20 minutes from the video itself. It was 20 minutes long. And then at the end, Russians, they call for reinforcements and eventually fully repelled the Ukrainian attack. But this gives you an idea of what Ukraine's trying to do in this region. They do want to attack in the region just to the east of Voruzhenia. And the reason why is because there's a road that connects Stormlinivka, which is under Russian control, an important hub in the region, and Kremenchuk. And they want to cut that road off. It has a lot of fortifications on it, and it's also just important for cohesion between different parts of the Russian front line. And then from there, the Ukrainian aim, at least, would be to secure Kremenchuk in order to cut off the one road that Russia is currently using to supply the village of Novodonetske from Kremenchuk itself. And of course, you could use the open fields, but it just is just a case that the Russians would prefer to be using that one road instead of going through the fields. That would be also in a very, very narrow corridor. So that's the Ukrainian thinking. Now, moving on to Andriivka, here you'll see that the Ukrainians have posted more and more photos and videos from ground zero, from the village itself, which shows that now there's a higher concentration of Ukrainian infantry within the village, and they're feeling more and more comfortable sending in their own forces into the region. And they're standing out in the open, which does mean that, at least to a certain extent, the Russians are not always striking in that region. There were certainly Russian artillery strikes there 2 days ago. On the 17th and 16th, there were some very heavy Russian strikes. But when this video was recorded specifically, you could see that there's basically no sign of shelling, and the Ukrainians were able to raise their flag, hoist it unabated on the remnants of the village, what remains of it. You could see that there are still structures over there. I don't want people to think that it's completely an open field, because the Ukrainians will definitely be trying to send forces to try to turn it into a permanent position. It will be difficult, but I do think they'll try to use basements. They'll try to use whatever remains of the structures to set up a permanent camp looking into the future. And I'll actually go to the map to show why. But here you could see like an underground section of the village. Now, with the capture of Andriivka, the Ukrainians, they have two options with their garrison in the region, which mainly consists of the 3rd Assault Brigade, which has been fighting for a pretty long time. So there's questions as to whether they may be rotated out now. But it seems like they are still on the front line recording themselves. So it seems like for now they're still in the battle. The question is whether they will attack directly to the east towards the next Russian position in this region, which could be considered a defense line. And I don't mean like massive trenches. I just mean that this is where the Russian forces are stationed, and it's about a distance of, let's say, 3-4 kilometers away from the current front line around the rail line. Whether the Ukrainians try advancing in that direction, or whether they now concentrate their focus on Krokhmal'ne with the help of the 28th Mechanized Brigade, which is the Ukrainian unit that has really been at the vanguard of Ukraine's attacks on the village of Krokhmal'ne and across the entire Donbas Canal for the past like 3 months, or even more in some cases. And this unit, they were able to actually cross over the canal in the positions over here in the first place, which gave the Ukrainians the opportunity to flank Krokhmal'ne from the north. And now the flanking of Krokhmal'ne has not totally been completed from the north, but it's been bolstered given the fact that Ukraine has control over Andriivka. So what you could see, and we're already seeing Ukrainian attacks in this direction, nothing serious yet, nothing that would cause the immediate collapse of the Russian lines in Krokhmal'ne yet. But what you're seeing starting to form at least is Ukrainian attacks in the areas to the north in these fields. The Russians have prepared defenses over here. They've had a lot of time to prepare these defenses because the Ukrainian focus has been on Andriivka and on Klishchiivka. So the Russian units in Krokhmal'ne have certainly dug in, and there's a lot of Russian forces in that region. There's a lot of Russian airborne forces. There's actually Chechen elements as well. And there's motorized rifle brigades involved, like the 57th. That's a big one that has been noted. So we'll have to see about that. And since my last video, there's still not any footage showing the Ukrainians within the northeastern part of Klishchiivka, where I have the gray zone. I just don't have any footage of that, so that's why I'm being cautious. I know it is pedantic, but I'm trying to make the map as accurate as possible. But nonetheless, when zooming out and looking at the entire situation in Klishchiivka and Andriivka, I want to give some perspective. The battle in this region, you could say that more generally, not specifically in the village of Klishchiivka itself, but in the entire sector, which I would say is within this blue rectangle. The Ukrainians were launching their initial attacks in this direction from the north, from Ivanivske and across the Donbas Canal, starting in late June. And it really started to heat up in late July when the Ukrainians initially entered the southern parts and the western parts of Klishchiivka for the first time. They were able to nearly take over the entirety of the village. The Russians had to withdraw past the rail line, but eventually they counterattacked after receiving reinforcements from the VDV and were able to retake the village itself. Now we know that Ukraine has been able to retake it again, but this should just give you an idea of how long the battle has been lasting. Not only in Klishchiivka, but also Andriivka, which is much smaller, but the battles over there have also been lasting for multiple months. But you could say in the past few weeks, it has really heated up with engagement between the 3rd Brigade of the Ukrainians and the 72nd Brigade of the Russians. And regarding the units, really on both sides, there are some very well-trained units, very highly experienced units that could have been used potentially in Zaporozhye for either the attack there for the counteroffensive or for the active defense in that region. But because of the heightened fighting within the sector, units from both sides, and I'll just go through more generally the ones on both sides. You have on the Ukrainian side some assault battalions that could have been used for offensive activity like Lyut, 5th or 3rd. You have mechanized brigades. You have air assault brigades, 2 of them specifically. On the Russian side, you have the Chechen forces, of course. You have VDV units. Russia has moved some VDV units to the Robotyne sector, but you see there's a lot of them over here on the map that have marked around the Klishchiivka sector. So all in all, it is a two-way street, and both sides have been affected by the fact that there's heavy fighting over here and have been forced to divert forces to that effort as a result. And lastly, we're looking at the Luhansk front, where fighting across the entire line at this point is positional in nature. But just to give you guys an idea of one area where there is some changes, there were some noted movements and activity. It is around the village of Krokhmal'ne, which is a bit to the north of Novodonetske and Klishchiivka. In this region, the Russian positions were around the rail line, and they still are at this point. But what happened is, according to this RIA Novosti segment, and they have the video footage, I have it linked on the map, you had these Russian forces. They were able to advance past the line of contact, past the rail line and the hedgerow over there, and reach the highway which connects the city of Kupiansk actually to the front line for the Ukrainians. So it's an important supply hub. And they were able to reach that point. They were able to advance through the open areas and some of the bushy areas in that region before actually entering the village of Krokhmal'ne itself. It's a relatively small village on the front line, so there's most likely not a lot of Ukrainian forces in this region. There's a few ditches and trenches that were dug in that region that the Russians temporarily took over, but it seems like at the end they withdrew back to their original positions around Volodymyrivka. And the reason why is because this was not meant as a Russian offensive or anything of that sort. It was just meant to gauge the Ukrainian attacks over there, to gauge the Ukrainian defense, and to gauge the strength of the resistance and the volume of it. And that's more generally what we've been seeing from the Russian side and also from the Ukrainian side to a certain extent across the entire line in this region. But that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.